Good morning to you all, and if you're on a different time zone, good afternoon, and welcome to today's conversation with Brigadier General Duke Pirak from U.S. Central Command, also known as CENTCOM. This conversation is part of MEI's Defense Leadership Series. It's a new initiative that we created in June, not too long ago this year, and it was inaugurated by Central Command Commander General Frank McKenzie. I'm Bilal Saab. I run the Defense and Security Program of the Institute, and this morning I have the distinct pleasure of moderating this third episode of the series. The first being, as I just mentioned, with General McKenzie, and the second one with Michelle Flournoy, the former Undersecretary of Defense for Policy. Brigadier General Pirak is the Deputy Director of Strategy, Plans and Policy in CENTCOM's J5, or I'd like to call the think tank unit of the command, right? And he's speaking to us today from Tampa, Florida, home of the command. Duke is the go-to person for all security cooperation issues and activities in the AOR. That's the area of responsibility of the command. And having myself overseen that portfolio on the civilian side, I know that portfolio is pretty large, given that it's a large region. Prior to his assignment, Brigadier General Pirak served as the director, chief of the National Guard Bureau Action Group. He oversaw military readiness of, let's just say, almost 500,000 Army and Air National Guard personnel. That's a lot of people. He was also a member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, military advisor to the Secretary of Defense, National Security Council, and the President. Duke has had a long and distinguished career in the U.S. Army, U.S. Air Force, I should say, I'm sorry, and as an F-15 pilot and also an F-22 pilot. Commander and instructor, he was deployed to several theaters around the world, including the Middle East. He has received numerous honors and awards. His academic resume is as impressive as his professional resume, and I'm not going to mention all of it, but he does have a BA from the University of Washington in Seattle, an MA from the National War College, and he's earned several certificates for courses and training he has completed over the years. Now, I've known Brigadier General Pirak for some time. I had the privilege of working with him and his team on the very topic of security cooperation. And hey, I'd like to believe that we did accomplish some things and we moved the needle a tiny bit. Juice, it's good to see you, brother. It's good to see you, my friend, and welcome to MEI, and thank you a lot for doing this.
Thank you. It's a real privilege. I really appreciate it, and of course, thank you for your acknowledgement of my resume. I always joke that's just simply because I'm old, so you tend to accumulate things over time. I do want to say thank you, Bilal, personally, and thank you, MEI, for hosting me here. It's a particularly privilege to follow such distinguished speakers that you've had previously, and I'd like to do my part. But I just want to say I really appreciate the partnership between MEI and CENTCOM, particularly with engagements like this. And I'd also say to all our listeners out there, certainly to you, Bilal, and your new family, and everybody at MEI, hopefully everybody is staying safe and healthy in these very difficult times.
Thank you very much. I appreciate it. Okay, we've got an hour or so. So let's just start. I guess it's a good way to start with the definition. You know, we're talking about security cooperation here, and it's a term that you see often in many strategic documents. And DoD has its own definition, CENTCOM as well. Tell us just, how do you view security cooperation? How do you define it? What's the best way to view this very important tool that we have in our strategic repertoire?
It's actually right away a very interesting question, right? So yeah. I think there's broad agreement in terms of how we define security cooperation, perhaps not so much agreement in terms of how we view it. So I guess what I'll do is I'll give you a technical definition from two aspects. We'll talk about what our joint doctrine defines security cooperation as, and then I'll also talk to you about how Central Command defines it. And then we'll talk a little bit on views there. So if you'll accommodate my technical definition, joint doctrine defines security cooperation as all the Department of Defense interactions with foreign security establishments to build security relationships that promote specific United States security interests, develop allied and partner nation military and security capabilities for self-defense and multinational operations, and provide the United States forces with peacetime and contingency access to allied and partner nations. So that's the very technical term there. Let me just give you CENTCOM's take on this. CENTCOM's definition of security cooperation certainly comports with the broader definition. But here at CENTCOM, we like to say that we work bilaterally with each partner to apply security cooperation authorities and programs that further U.S. interests. Most often, these are mutual interests. In other words, the partner has a definitive stake. The imperative for security cooperation as an enterprise is that we're also pursuing the U.S. interests. Partner buy-in with regard to those interests opens the door for us to apply relevant authorities and programs. So all of that to say is, we are beholden to the taxpayer to ensure that our U.S. taxpayer is getting their money's worth. It's not just about military charity, right? There has to be an objective here. And all roads lead back to what the U.S. interests are. And in most cases, our security cooperation programs, I think we do a pretty good job of ensuring that the U.S. interest and the partner interests are aligned, sort of the center of that Venn diagram there. Let's talk about my view of this, though, because it is an important program, particularly in light of our objectives codified in our new national defense strategy.
Mm-hmm.
I think what we're trying to create in Central Command, recognizing that many different countries and many different areas, many different aspects, many different challenges in the Central Command area of operations. But as a minimum, what we're looking to do is develop partners that are stable and secure, supporting their territorial integrity and sovereignty, sort of our minimalist objectives. Our maximalist objectives here would be to create associations, security associations, that are able to defend against a regional aggressor. Really, that's the ultimate goal of all of this. And I like to say, Bilal, you and I worked on these things together. Security cooperation programs are exactly that. They're programs. They take a lot of time in terms of planning, preparation, budgeting, take years to institute, are very difficult to measure in the near term. You really have to have the long view, long ball, as we call it there. And are difficult to change directions quickly on, right? So really it's the essence of strategy here. We have to be thinking over the horizon here. And I have to tell you, with all the sort of near-term challenges we have in the Middle East, it's fun to work on the long-term challenges, which is establishing these partnerships that we are in fact boosting those the sovereignty, territorial integrity, security, stability of our partner nations there. I'll add one aspect here to this as well. Let's talk about what U.S. interests are. It's sort of alluded to in the doctrinal definition. The sort of near-term U.S. interest typically is access, basing, and overflight. So it's the ability to ingress and egress from the theater to conduct operations there. But really, also inherent to U.S. interests is building a modicum of interoperability with these partners, so that we are able to, for lack of a better terminology, plug and play. We're trying to build the ability to where U.S. interests and our partner interests are aligned to conduct operations together. That's certainly something we're trying to get after there. And at some level, that interoperability might even lead to a level of interdependence where we actually need each other and where our interests are so perfectly aligned that we build a defense relationship to conduct said operations where there's alignment there. We need each other to do it.
Okay. Well, it's evident that you believe strongly that this tool is strategic in nature. Just tell me, how much weight does it have in the NDS?
Well, it's a tremendous weight in the NDS, right? So if you're thinking about line of effort 2 in the national defense strategy to build that rigid constellation of allies and partners, how does one do this? A myriad of ways, certainly engagement, exercise, things of that nature, but security cooperation is the program that, the foundational line of effort to that, right? And it's you had commented earlier, my friend, that we moved the needle a little bit. That unfortunately in the business of security cooperation is the mark of success here. It's just incremental change over time, and we really do have to have the long view here. As you're well aware, many of our partners, particularly Gulf nations that are cash rich, have a tendency to want to buy both material, and the assumption is that competency will come along with that. And that's not the case, right? You can buy marquee weapon systems that are interoperable with the United States and the coalition. That doesn't necessarily mean that we've instituted the culture to be able to employ those weapon systems in an efficient manner, an effective manner. And so that is also a key underpinning to security cooperation, is what we call the institutional capacity building piece there.
Yeah.
So back to the NDS question, absolutely. If the going in assumption is that the United States can't be everywhere all the time with equal measure, just simply at some point, even at $750 billion a year for our budget, we just can't be everywhere all the time. Then in key areas, you want to have reliable allies and partners. That can, again, with the minimalist objectives, take care of their own, and maximalist being able to deter a regional aggressor.
Yeah. So you mentioned the partners. We'll get to those in a minute, but let's keep it in-house for now. So you've agreed that the tool is strategic. It's a major pillar in the NDS. Tell me, in all honesty, if it gets the attention it deserves from leadership.
Well, you're kind of putting me on the spot with that one. Well, I mean, I think that look, I wouldn't be a very good advocate for security cooperation if I didn't argue that I wish that we had more attention, right?
Yeah.
So I do, however, I can legitimately tell you that even since your departure from the Pentagon, Bilal, there's been an uptick in the attention paid, particularly with regard to the strategic documents that provide the architecture by which we make our decisions and which we rate security cooperation programs. I'll admit to you that early on in my familiarity with security cooperation, I think a lot of what we had done in the past was just simply based on past practice and tradition. A lot of our efforts were basically in response to partner requests. But when we really sit down and do the very hard staff work to figure out that which is core to U.S. interest and our partner interests, and then we prioritize them in accordance with, the NDS objectives there, hopefully that gets, that has been codified in several key documents that has really helped the combatant commands like Central Command weigh these initiatives, one to end, as we say.
And I didn't necessarily mean CENTCOM leadership. I'm just talking national security community, right? And given that it's, a tool utilized by so many agencies, I just saw it, that there was always a challenge to put that issue on, the radar and the and the menu of, leadership.
Well, yeah, and I have to say, security cooperation is. It's there are many layers to this. At times it's hard to understand. It's we understand it conceptually, from a distance, kind of what it is, generally speaking, in the military enterprise, but actually digging into all the various funds and authorities and lines of effort, it's quite the labyrinth there.
Yeah. So, as you very well know, officials, lawyers, administrators are very careful not to confuse the security cooperation activities and portfolio of DoD, so under Title 10, right? Not to confuse it with the State Department's security assistance under Title 22, for a number of reasons, right? Budgetary, jurisdictional, and legal distinctions. So, tell me if that tension or if that distinction makes any sense in the real world, practically speaking. And I know we've been talking about deconflicting the two for quite a while now. Is that a pipe dream really, or are we getting closer to that deconfliction, which is critical to the success of the enterprise, right?
Yeah, well, another great question, and I appreciate it. Let me give you an initial reaction to that, one which I think you probably won't expect, and then let's dig down into a little bit of the why, and then we'll come back to talking about that initial reaction. And of course, Bilal, as always, I appreciate your challenge to me here. Look, I actually think I am a big fan of the system the way that it is. I think that through the distinct lines of effort between Department of State and Department of Defense, I think it provides the necessary influence to hold us accountable here to the taxpayer. And here's why. At first blush, particularly in the military domain, one might be frustrated because they don't control all aspects, recognizing, of course, that State Department, and we'll get into specifics in a second, have a huge play in assistance to countries to acquire defense-related military security capabilities, right? And so you think naturally one wants to go, well, why don't I control that? But again, I think it's a very necessary influence here. It's the security cooperation enterprise. Speaking of all forms of security assistance, security cooperation, foreign assistance and aid, it's an ecosystem held in balance. That's a good thing. And I often describe this by saying it's somewhat analogous to, you know, our Constitution, how it's been described in academic circles as an invitation to struggle. What that means is that we don't make hasty, haphazard decisions. And recognizing, of course, that security cooperation is a strategic program with decisions that are made over many years and implemented over many years, you know, planned for over time, budgeted and implemented in that regard. I think it should move somewhat slowly. That frustrates some military professionals who would appreciate security cooperation being tactically responsive. There are other funds to do those types of things. I might get back to that in a second here. Right. But I actually like the very deliberate pace of security cooperation programs and then the planning between the two departments to make sure we get it right. So did that answer shock you?
No, it didn't. I want to hear more about the joint planning in a second, because you just mentioned it, because we are definitely facing challenges as far as joint planning. But go ahead, continue, and then I'll ask you a follow-up question.
Yeah, so, you know, and again, I'm only joking with you, my friend, because I think at times it's very common for people in my position to express a degree of frustration that they don't control everything. I actually enjoy working within the system. I actually enjoy aligning interests within the U.S. government and really achieving the highest possible level of advocacy, you know, with, of course, the pinnacle being agreement, which we've seen lately at times on certain key issues between the Secretary of Defense and the Secretary of State themselves, which is very helpful here. And I think, you know, in terms of how our government works, if, you know, successful programs, you might be able to implement things quickly, but successful programs that endure have those two key elements, right? Widest possible alignment of interest and highest level of advocacy. And if we can get those things, Bilal, we have a program that's probably going to last some time, because we probably got it right.
Okay.
So let's get back to the why portion of this. You know, I again, for the benefit of our audience, you know, let's talk about some of the technical aspects here and the legal delineations. It's important to remind everybody that the Department of State has executive responsibility to administer what we call foreign assistance programs. Yep. Such as FMF, which is, you know, the ability to finance the purchase of defense articles, right? IMAT, which is the funding to send foreign military officers to training in the United States, and other programs under what we call Title 22 there, with the State Department all being responsible for that. You know, I would defer to how state professionals like to address those lines of effort. Generally speaking, I would say that their version of doctrine suggests that these Title 22 programs are foreign policy tools intended to promote the American way of life and values, respect for individuals and human rights, belief in the rule of law, and an appreciation of the civilian control of the military. And of course, we 100% support that. On the other hand, the Department of Defense is largely focusing on what we call Title 10, you know, the kinds of monies that are intended to shore up U.S. military security interests. Right. And so, you know, we have control on that. Now, where the two come together, there's a couple of fora where that happens. One, most notably, is at the Department of State, where we just had a forum over 3 days, virtually, of course, in the COVID times here, with the Joint Security Sector Assistance Review, where typically those things come together. So we just try to make sure that we're fully aligned. And I have to be honest with you, I am always enriched by my interactions with our state colleagues. There's just simply things that are just not on my radar. And getting back to my initial, you know, sort of doctrinal definition for the State Department and how they view security cooperation, they use that as leverage for things to achieve other U.S. government objectives. So while that might not necessarily always comport with my security interests, looking at the broader U.S. government interests, you know, I think we get it right. And so what we, you know, for that constant interaction, we bang through these things and find broad agreement. I'll tell you that the point that I have to drive home is, as you're probably tracking, Bilal, every ambassador abroad has an integrated country strategy, which is intended to align all U.S. government interest lines of effort in support of U.S. government interests. That is a key entry point for me on that Title 10 piece to make sure that my security cooperation plan, that which DoD can control and influence, is nested within that overall country strategy. And it's a two-way bit of communication, right? I'm enriched from understanding what our ambassador wants to achieve in the broader US government, and vice versa. I would argue that the ambassadors are enriched by what we're trying to get after from a security standpoint there. But all that to say, I kind of perhaps gave you a Pollyannish view of the world. My friend, what this means with these two massive organizations, both influencing the same thing, with two giant bureaucracies navigating this labyrinth of legal and technical compliance issues. At times, security cooperation is not as responsive as we'd like it to be. And again, it's a very deliberate process that is years in the making, not months or weeks.
Let's talk very briefly about money, because as we describe this enterprise, for members of the audience who might not know, they would believe or presume that this is a very large, program, when in fact it's not. I mean, if you look at how much money we have attached to it, it's roughly $1 billion global, right?
Yeah.
And then you wonder, with the strategic objectives that you just defined, and this being a very important tool, as we just agreed, is it a challenge, or not necessarily, that we have so few resources allocated to that program in relation to the other aspects of security cooperation and security systems that are far greater and far larger, including the foreign military sales and all that? Is the money an issue, or you can still meet many of those objectives with the amount that you have?
Well, I mean, I think we do a pretty good job with the amount that we have, but again, I would always, I wouldn't be doing my job if I wasn't advocating for more, my friend. But look, let's take a step back, and I'm going to, just absolutely poorly misquote something that my state colleagues like to talk about, and it's basically American polling numbers that I think when the average American is asked, how much do we give out in foreign aid, they're just grossly exaggerated. People, you hear 20%, 30% of our budget. Really, it's very, very small. And in that regard, we're with regard to DoD security cooperation, we're kindred souls with agencies like state and USAID. We are actually talking for the most part in the millions of dollars, not billions.
Right.
And so when we're making difficult choices in and amongst millions of dollars there, we just quite simply can't cover down on all of our needs that really are actually getting after key U.S. interests. I mean, if you think about with the line of effort number 2, with the national defense strategy, building this rigid constellation of allies and partners, and only doing that with millions as opposed to billions, that's a tough haul. Now, there's a distinction that must be made there, and you kind of alluded to it. Let's talk about foreign military sales.
Right.
And we know that there are partners in the CENTCOM area of operations that are more wealthy and are able to pay in the billions. And just so happens that in the CENTCOM AOR, we account for about 40% of the total foreign military sales overall. I believe in 20, we're talking about $26 billion. It's nice because obviously there's a support there to the U.S. industrial base with these customers that are buying equipment that theoretically should be interoperable with the United States. So there's an ancillary benefit there. We, of course, are in the business of coaching and mentoring to try to ensure that they're buying the right things and that our partners are using that material responsibly. And also, we're trying to do the hard work of inculcating that culture of maintenance and training, so that that it has lasting effects there. In some cases, foreign military sales support contributes to the overall largesse, the capability of our staff to support customers that aren't cash rich, right? So it pays for key staff positions that supports what we call significant security cooperation initiatives for partners, where we're actually giving them the money to cover down on these initiatives there. So generally speaking, Bilal, in CENTCOM, those Gulf partners there, but there are 2 other key areas of the CENTCOM area of operations that require a significant amount of assistance. One is Central Asia, just up to the north there, where we're talking our security cooperation efforts, Bilal, are very, very modest. Very, very modest at best. And it's personally frustrating to me because I think it's a missed opportunity to cover down on key NDS objectives, particularly when we're talking about great power competition.
Okay.
And we're trying to shape the preferences of our partners, and we're trying to bring them into the fold here.
Right.
I often like to challenge my state colleagues and to say that there is, in fact, a soft power aspect to the military component, the military instrument of national power, because in many of these countries, we differ on politics, speaking to Central Asia, but we have a shared interest in, again, territorial integrity and sovereignty, and it gives us an opening. It starts there. And what occurs next, Bilal, is the brand exposure to the United States, and it's proven to be successful. And then getting to the last part of CENTCOM, of course, is the Levant area, with countries for the most part that do need a significant amount of our help. You know, but again, we're really not, you know, relative to the overall size of the U.S. defense budget of $750 billion a year, we're talking about very, very small percentages.
But tell me more about this challenge, because I think you are raising something that's very important regarding this difficult adjustment of the entire enterprise to meet the new priority of the great power competition. I know, you know, that the overwhelming emphasis in terms of resources and perhaps attention has been on the Levant, right? It's Jordan and Lebanon who have always been the largest recipients of Title 10. But you want more money going to Uzbekistan to meet, you know, the challenge of competing with China, right? So do you feel like the enterprise has gradually shifted, or do you still feel like there's a lot of work to be done still?
Well, I think both of those things. I think that we're gradually shifting. I think in large part, it's really been due to the sponsorship of our commander here, General McKenzie, who has recognized this opportunity, and in recent interactions at the highest levels of the Department of Defense has talked about the opportunities to invest in Central Asia. So we're trying to influence some of those strategic guidance documents that I referred to earlier to recognize that opportunity there. You know, I'll just give you a couple of seconds on that one, if you don't mind. You know, I think we're you know, it's the military, right? And it's therefore this larger bureaucracy, and we have what as you know, we call the unified command plans, which divides up the world into these different geographic areas. But once you do that, you know, you infuse a bit of a pathology there, right? Where in some ways you have combatant commands competing against each other. And that which at times becomes overlooked is the seams and gaps in between the commands, right? And worse yet, it's my contention that, for instance, if you say we are in the midst of this great power competition, and if one were to focus on Russia, then naturally we would defer to EUCOM to be the lead on the Russia problem. I don't know that makes a whole lot of sense when you just look at the map and you realize that really Russia is a EUCOM, CENTCOM, and Indo-PACOM problem. And of course, in many ways, China is analogous to that. So the oddity is that there is, in fact, a trend in terms of the implementation, the operationalization of the national defense strategy. Think to have the joint force think about global campaign plans. But we've yet to develop global security cooperation plans, to sit back and look at the map and think, okay, where are these key areas of investment, right? Where are the weak spots? Where are areas where we can invest that are in fact cost imposing to our competitors?
That's right.
And so we're working very hard to drive that within you know, the enterprise here. But as the joke goes, right, it's sort of like changing the direction of the aircraft carrier with an oar. You know, nothing happens overnight, right? It's over time, and we're doing our part to try to change things.
Yeah, I want to spend the second half on our efforts in the region, but before I do that, one final question, because I think it's important. You've already alluded to it, Juice. So in December of 2016, major effort to come up with a document to reform the entire enterprise. You are very well aware of it, and thanks to the efforts of the late Senator John McCain and his staff, they came up with security cooperation reforms in the 2017 NDAA, right? Very briefly for our audience, tell us, what is the bottom line of those reforms, and why are they so unprecedented and monumental?
Well, I just, again, I have to say overall, I have been, at this security cooperation business over the last year and change, and talking to my civilian professionals who have been at this for some time. For the most part, they absolutely welcome this. And
Yep.
it's due to something I alluded to earlier, Bilal, where a lot of previous programs were perhaps based on past practice, tradition, a lot of inertia behind the status quo, perhaps a little less strategic thinking involved there, perhaps more weight placed on what the partner requests or desires than what actually gets after U.S. interests.
Sure.
And then difficulty, of course, once we've capitalized on the security cooperation initiatives in terms of measuring and evaluation, right? So that's the essence of the NDAA 17, getting after all those things. It's very welcomed, and I think that we are held accountable to the taxpayer in that regard. It's very
Yep.
important. I
Yep.
think one of the manifold changes that were made in the overall system, and I really have to give credit to Lieutenant General Hooper and the DSCA enterprise, was the institution of the Defense Security Cooperation University, and a formal certification program, which was, of course, directed by Congress, and it was a heavy lift, but a formal certification program for all the professionals involved in security cooperation. And it's one that somewhat mirrors our defense acquisition enterprise. And I think it's just very, very necessary. I think the initial efforts have been very successful here. The more senior workforce is having to adapt to some of these new requirements, Bilal, but I think it's a good thing, particularly when you're talking about wanting to appropriately navigate these labyrinth of legal and technical requirements with security cooperation dollars,
Yep.
and making sure that we're held accountable there.
Yep. Okay. Unless you want to add something else.
No, I just said that the other part is just a change that's taken some time, but the monitoring and evaluation piece, making sure that the American taxpayer is getting their money's worth out of this. And that for me has been an interesting conversation there, related to the very first part when we were talking security cooperation. Is sometimes these are very subjective assessments. How far along has a partner progressed? How, in relative terms, have we been able to cover down on U.S. interests, particularly, Bilal, if that U.S. interest is more centered around the ability to have access basing and overflight than necessarily partner capability, right? And so it's an interesting conversation, but I appreciate being held accountable to our civilian leadership.
Fair enough. Okay, what I did with Michelle is Michelle Florno is a regional tour. So I'll do the same with you. And I'd like to start with our biggest investment, and that's Iraq.
Yes.
And to tie it to security cooperation, we have a major effort to train, advise, assist, and equip the Iraqi military. Tell us, where are we in that effort? And to tie it to more recent times, has the COVID-19 situation dramatically affected our rhythm, our plans, as far as training and equipping the Iraqis?
Well, yeah, that's another wonderful question. We could probably take a whole hour or more on Iraq here. So I will try to make my comments meaningful here. First off, I have to say, a good many of us in this business have spent, particularly this generation, my generation that is, has spent a good portion of their professional career dealing with Iraq in some form or fashion, certainly Afghanistan too, and others there. And I have to say, the events as of late have been remarkable. If you think back to where we were, I am old enough to have flown, no-fly zone missions over Iraq in the early 2000s, pre 9/11, when we were dealing with a whole different leadership system of government and a real antagonist. And what we have now, thinking back to that early time in my career, and what we have in terms of our relationship with Iraq and the hope for the future, is just really, I think, a bright spot against the backdrop of a long and difficult history, right? So where are we? You know, recently, as you're aware, on the 11th of June, our state colleagues were able to facilitate step one in a strategic dialogue between the United States and Iraq, talking about the future of the bilateral relationship there. There are a number of things that, you know, a little bit out of my lane, but obviously impacts us. You know, in the past, as you're aware, there was a non-binding resolution from the Iraqi Council of Representatives about the expulsion of foreign troops there. So that's kind of one of those near-term things that we have to work through politically there. But I'm just really encouraged by the readout from that engagement, from the communique shared on both sides, that clearly the government of Iraq and the new government there wants us to stay and is encouraging the transition of our campaign to secure the long-term defeat of ISIS. So now you kind of talked about, you know, our investment there and how we've been doing that. Certainly, I have had a hand or the DoD, you know, enterprise has had a hand in traditional security cooperation initiatives, but a good portion of the money that has gone into supporting the ISF in particular has been through a fund called CTEF. The Coalition Train Equip Fund to Defeat ISIS, and that has been very successful because of the incredible legal latitude afforded to us in that line of effort there. So as opposed to the security cooperation programs where we're really thinking about long-term and sustainment and things of that nature, CTEF is a fund that allows the warfighting headquarters, the Coalition Joint Task Force Operation Inherent Resolve Commander, to be responsive to changes in battlefield conditions. Now that program is still going strong, and Congress has authorized that well into the future there. I think that will be around as long as you have a CJTF OIR headquarters, a warfighting headquarters in the region. But that is an example of something that we're taking a hard look at in the headquarters as we think about how any particular line of effort in CTEF would be normalized into an enduring security cooperation program, some other form of Title 10 assistance there. But back to the strategic level, certainly the COVID-19 pandemic paused, you know, the training that we were conducting, both the OIR training and of course the NATO Mission Iraq training, and minimized joint patrols and whatnot. There were some force protection issues within Iraq as well due to events going all the way back into December where there's a consolidation. And the general trend with OIR has been less bases, less faces, you know, kind of consolidating down because of that reduced requirement. But it was, in fact, a wonderful opportunity to do a reset, a recalibration, of course, as we think into the future on the invitation of the government of Iraq about what kind of assistance they would really like. And I have to say, for lack of a better way to describe it, Bilal, we are now able to focus more on training above the division level. So we're talking about the kind of the graduate level training, institutional capacity building, advising and mentoring their leadership, right? As I said too early on in our conversation, it's one thing to just to give a partner a bunch of stuff, right? But it's quite another to give them the ability to orchestrate, force present, make tactical, operational, strategic decisions, you know, think about the long-term impacts of those decisions. That's a whole different way of thinking. And that's the really hard generational type work that we're able to get engaged in now.
You can say that again. If you recall, Duke, 2011, some would say there was a premature withdrawal of U.S. troops, and then you saw what happened several years later with the takeover of Mosul and the offensive by ISIS. What is our comfort level today, or in the near future, in the abilities of the Iraqi military, given all the efforts that you just described? If we were to withdraw or just reduce our presence, how likely is it that that scenario would be repeated?
Well, hey, this is a great question. You know, first off, I'd recognize that, you know, this is perhaps a statement of the obvious here. 2011 really caught us off guard, caught us, you know, and I think it's always easy sort of to look at what happened and perhaps assign causal factors there. But the reality of it, you've been in this business for a long time, Bilal. You'll know that often the answer is much more elusive and complicated, right? There's a myriad of different things that we perhaps didn't foresee back at that time.
Right.
And hindsight's always 20/20, unfortunately, not foresight. Where are we at today? Look, we through by, with, and through allies and partners here have been able to secure the territorial defeat of ISIS. What that means specifically is ISIS remains a very dangerous terrorist organization. However, with very, very limited capacity to coordinate and to quite simply hold territory or population at risk. So while I think we should really appreciate the success that we've had as of late, and I'll get to the ISF piece in a second here, we just need to keep our foot on the gas, right? So we need to very quickly recalibrate, as we talked about before in the OIR campaign, and provide our Iraqi partners the kind of assistance they need to secure the enduring defeat of ISIS, simply put. So I think we're not seeing, there's been some conversations about the attacks as of late and whether or not we're experiencing a resurgence, and it just so happens when it comes right down to it, I think, ISIS has the desire to resurge, just simply doesn't have the capacity to do it, with violence levels well below, seasonal norms there, right?
At least not rapidly, right?
What's that?
At least not rapidly.
At least not rapidly, yeah. And so so for those that point out, like to talk about the definition of resurgence and this and that, I'll just say, look, let's agree on this, that there's always a threat of resurgence anytime we take our eye off the ball. Okay, so it's important, perhaps the lesson we learned in the past is to maintain focus. And in this case, that is transitioning our efforts with assistance to the ISF to the kinds of things that they need to, again, secure that long-term enduring defeat.
Yeah, and I don't want to put all that weight on your shoulders, Duke. Obviously, resurgence is a product, as you said yourself, of many other things, including the very politics of the country, which obviously need to be addressed. So it's not entirely your responsibility, to defeat such a large movement that obviously is impacted by many other societal factors, right?
But I really appreciate you bringing that up. I've had the privilege of presenting to what we call the Defeat ISIS Coalition's political military consultation series, right? Where the political directors and their military counterparts from key coalition nations get together. It's an OSD-led effort. Ms. Wilbarger is the primary in that, and I've had the privilege of supporting her efforts there, giving the view from CENTCOM and OIR, and we had a very productive conversation this last round about sort of reaffirming where we are in terms of the territorial defeat of ISIS. And as part of that conversation, we were able to look at perhaps what now is the limits of the military instrument of national power. There are other instruments that really, in combination with the military aspect, secure that long-term defeat. The military alone was never going to be the ultimate solution to this problem. And there are some very vexing, challenging, political issues internal to Iraq that have to be addressed. But what I'm very proud of is we have established the conditions for those things to flourish here. We have a level of stability and security that we have not enjoyed in the past. And we have been able to mitigate any threats emanating from that area back to the homeland. So the conditions are perfect, but we got to keep our eye on the ball. Gotcha.
Next door, Syria. Given that this is a movement, obviously, that found.
They're getting harder, not easier, Bilal.
It's a movement that has found home in both countries and other places around the region. So, just very briefly, tell us: are we still training the Syrian Democratic Forces, and what kind of effort do we still have in that part of the world, given the very minimal presence that we have?
So we're also in a bit of a COVID pause with those things, and so we have a presence in what's called the Northeast Syrian Security Zone, and we'll remain there, and sort of waiting a political decision ultimately. But we continue, our defeat ISIS efforts continue in that part of the world, and those are very important efforts. I have to say, it's impossible to talk about Syria without stepping away and looking at the broader problem here. It's, we often, observe within the military enterprise here, it's almost like a Tom Clancy novel, right? With all the factors at play here, it is in some ways an epicenter for great power competition. There are lots of, there are myriad of strange associations and affiliations, all, with all of it being right there in that smallest part of the world. I do think that, our presence right now in terms of our current mission is an important presence. It is important in terms of securing the long-term defeat there of ISIS, particularly considering that, when are the cases that we know a group like ISIS is going to flourish? Anytime they can take advantage of a collapsed nation, and where the government is not fundamentally able to exercise its writ and control over a territory or a population, then you have these conditions. And certainly the economic conditions are difficult. Civil war, it's not a rosy outlook there. So we continue our very important mission there. Certainly COVID has kind of paused some of the things that you're referring to, and we wait a political decision about our long-term presence.
Yeah. It's virtually impossible to talk about all of our partners because it's such a large region for you guys and it's such a large AOR. And I recall when I was overseeing the Central Asian states, I had significant challenges. I mean, I just didn't know much about that whole region. So it's going to be the same deficit here in this conversation. I'm not going to address those. But I want to talk about a little bit about Lebanon, stay in the Levant for a minute, and then we'll move on to the Gulf and then wrap it up. So Lebanon is, relatively speaking, one of the more promising cases, given our partnership with the Lebanese Armed Forces. CENTCOM leadership has said some very nice things about that partner. Our track record there over the past decade or so is quite positive. And so I want to hear from you. Tell me, what is it about the Lebanese Armed Forces that they do better? What is it that they get better than others? And why has it been once again, relatively speaking, there's no perfect cases around here, right? Why has it been a more promising case than most others?
Well, it's really interesting, Aaron. I would just say, generally speaking, the Lebanese Armed Forces is a bright spot against a backdrop of just a very difficult situation for the government of Lebanon and its people. It's certainly a very sad and concerning state of affairs that we're all watching here. And as the government is still trying to maintain control and navigate these very difficult times, it has been able to rely on the LAF as an institution. Mm-hmm. And we hear in polling time and time again that with all of the uncertainty and all the skepticism of the Lebanese people about their government, they look at the LAF as something that is reliable. It's an organization that is trusted, right? Mm-hmm. And so that's an important thing to build on there, okay? And, it's sort of like, I guess it would be kind of like Maslow's hierarchy, right? With the, down at food and water would be the basic semblance of security. And right. We're able to provide that through our partnership with the LAF. It's not an exaggeration to say that really the ability for the LAF to continue to do its good work is almost entirely dependent upon our aid to them. So we advocate very strongly here in CENTCOM that should continue. And obviously, whether or not and to what degree we do that is subject to civilian control. But the argument that we make is really the LAF is the one thing keeping that country together right now in their very difficult state of affairs. Mm-hmm. They've had some successes. You've alluded to that. Operation Dawn of the Hills was a mission that was executed by the LAF without U.S. boots on the ground, ridding the country of ISIS. They've got just about 80% control of their territory there. I think they've been able to prove themselves to the Lebanese people as a not only viable but preferred alternative to supporting security as opposed to Hezbollah, right? They're about to take over portions of the maritime domain from the UNIFIL Maritime Task Force there. And so, despite all these difficulties, Bilal, we see a LAF that continues to advance professionally and capably. I will echo General McKenzie's words that certainly this organization is not a perfect organization by any stretch of the imagination, but it's one that we see as responsive to us and grateful, and dollars spent in Lebanon tend to have an outsized impact there overall in terms of providing that modicum of security.
From 1 to 10, 10 being the most, how much of a fan are you of IMET? Because, you know, when you look at the Lebanese officers, a lot of those guys came over here to the United States and to study in military institutions. So are you also a big fan of IMET?
You know, if you could give me 11, then I would tell you 11. Absolutely. You know, having been a product of, you know, professional military education with our foreign partners, I think absolutely, you know, the opportunity to bring folks over to the United States, not just for short periods of time, but for a year, where they really get to be able to think in an academic environment. Let's be honest, they aren't always able to do those types of things in their own countries, to be able to think freely and to challenge convention and to challenge their own government's policy there. So to be able to do that in an academic environment, I absolutely am a big fan of that. And of course, this is what allows us to shape future generations of leaders. Many colleagues from my National War College class who've gone on to do incredible things. And of course, that builds that very necessary network of cooperation between US military and our counterparts all over the world there. So I will say though, Bilal, it's another example of something that, perhaps to the less informed, is a form of, I guess, military charity here. But you really have to have the long view. You have to really play long ball here and think about the kinds of impact we're able to have on future leaders in other countries. And when you see how these leaders have gone on, that have been educated in the United States, gone on and made fundamental changes in their armed forces in terms of how they're organized, trained, equipped, how they behave, standards of conduct, things of that nature, that sort of mirror our way of thinking, you know, that's that sign of success. But one must think strategically and think of returns that happen over many years, not just tomorrow and the coming weeks, right? Many years.
Well, former CENTCOM Commander General Joe Votel, who's now part of the MEI family, I believe in describing the program said that dollar for dollar, this is one of the most, you know, significant military investments that we have. And I'm sure you agree with that.
Well, absolutely. And I would say, I absolutely concur with General Votel. And again, being a product of this type of experience, the communication is two-way. You know, I have been enriched by perspectives that I otherwise would not have had exposure to and wouldn't necessarily understand. So when we're able to sort of, in a classroom environment, build up that trust and confidence in each other and the relationship and really, you know, get real, as it were, for a moment, I have really been enriched about, you know, particular points of contention all over the globe with a perspective that I just simply wouldn't have had, you know, in a more vanilla academic environment.
Sure, let's talk about the Gulf partners, recognizing that there are some important differences among them. Obviously, this is not one unified bloc by any means. Differences in priorities, differences in abilities, and what have you. So, but there's that trio of states with the Saudis, the Emiratis, and the Qataris that do share one thing, which is wealth. So, as you said yourself before, you know, they come in with their own cash and they use the FMS system to acquire whatever weapons and equipment that they feel they need. That's a good thing. Okay, nobody's hating that you have the wealth to acquire those systems that you need for your military needs. So, but there's a challenge with that, right? The challenge being is that because we do not have that hook, let's call it a hook, right? Of them being under a security cooperation program, a systematic one under Title 10. Therefore, we do not have much of an ability to offer the advice, offer the training, and the things that you described before. How do you address that challenge, right? Because we want to advise them in ways that are quite important, not only for them, but also for us as well. I mean, you see what the Saudi campaign in Yemen has been, and the eternal question is always, if only we could just do more to advise them, right? And then show them the right way to do aerial targeting and locate enemy targets and intelligence and all that. So is this sort of like a mixed blessing to have your own, resources to come in and use the FMS system without us having greater ability to influence their acquisition process? I know there are other mechanisms. It doesn't have to be security cooperation program. There are other platforms, other mechanisms, but the question remains, do we use enough of those to positively influence their military trajectories?
Well, that's a tremendous question, and one I'll have to just unpack a little bit, and perhaps recharacterize a couple of kind of assertions you may have made in that question there, and also be mindful of the time. Look, I would say generally speaking, yes, it's of concern. Partners that have their own cash and can sort of do their own thing. One always has to be concerned to make sure that they're buying the right things. They're using the appropriate level of focus and precision in their defense planning, we call it, to build the kind of force structure necessary to actually do the job there. So I would say it's probably an exaggeration to say that with foreign military sales we can't control it. Actually, we can. There's a number of things that we don't have to. It's a U.S. government decision. And the Secretary of Defense holds a lot of the keys to the kingdom on the ability to give, to sell certain things to certain partners there. So we do have that level of leverage. Where we lose leverage, my friend, is when our partners go to what's called direct commercial sale. Perhaps if they're not getting the answer they like from the United States, they can go directly to certain contractors. We do still have the ability to exercise some limits there. But then, of course, the problem is if they decide to go to another competitor, like the Chinese or the Russians, which are typically all too willing to sell just about anything, everything to our partners there. And of course, infuses another pathology there where it's challenging interoperability and things of that nature. Gulf partners who do have the capacity to buy things want the problem solved now. Right. And it's very often the case that our security cooperation programs that typically 2 to 3 year response time, these are program decisions. And by the time we get to the approvals and the manufacturing, all of that, some argue that it's late to need. I think DSCA has made incredible strides in our responsiveness there, working with U.S. industry. I think we're getting better. I really do. We have to make sure that, of course, that we're not just selling stuff and not holding our partners accountable. Congress asks us to ensure that we are inculcating the right kinds of capability to minimize or eliminate civilian casualties, for instance. That would be an example. So we've made tremendous strides, in particular working with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, of inculcating that culture of targeting development. And making sure that we're using the right kind of intelligence to develop these targets that are of military value, and that the Saudi military is holding themselves accountable to their mistakes there. And we've seen a tremendous degree of success, and you may have even seen some positive press recently in the progress that the Saudis have made. So I have to say, institutional capacity building is what we call it, is really been, it's part of the security cooperation puzzle. And, our partners actually on their own volition have shown great enthusiasm for some of these things. I kind of keep going back to the Saudi example, but they are also going through their own process of transformation where they're really wanting to get after these things, no longer just buying stuff, but are we buying the right things for the right reasons? And are we employing these things correctly? And are we thinking strategically, right? And so we have a number of efforts to assist them in that process. And and we see examples of that all over the Gulf. I would just say, my get off the stage comment in that regard is we have this unique opportunity here recently because of the change in the nature of the threat with regard to fully integrated air and missile defense, where we have Gulf partners coming together and wanting to create this shared architecture for detection and defense. And this is a really positive sign. And as I alluded to earlier, perhaps one example where, hard power has a soft power aspect. It's of no secret there is a rift between some of these countries here, but so far they've been very amenable to contributing to that shared architecture. And we're actually developing now within CENTCOM something that's relatively new, and that is a regional security cooperation initiative to build that architecture for for multiple nations at the same time. Whereas in the past, we've just focused on it piecemeal, looking at each nation, how they could contribute. We're doing that all together. We think that this might potentially be one of the key underpinnings to the security pillar of MESA, which is, as you know, an ambition of the US government in the future.
Right. Certainly didn't mean to suggest that we don't have control or leverage over the FMS process, but what I will submit to you that oftentimes we don't exercise that leverage. I mean, just look throughout history, we tend to be a little bit bullish and aggressive as far as arms sales, which in many ways automatically gives these guys leverage, especially that we are now in a great power competition with the Russians and the Chinese, and therefore we are even more amenable to selling without asking many questions, right? And so, no, it didn't mean to suggest we don't have control. Certainly we do, but
yeah,
it's just that, oftentimes you don't exercise it because there's
very fair criticism, very fair assertion. And it's important, just like anything else, to not confuse efforts with results. Selling a bunch of stuff does not mean that our partner now has this newfound competency all on its own. Items sitting on the ramp, fancy airplanes sitting on the ramp doesn't mean that they necessarily know how to employ it. So you're absolutely right.
Yeah. I may have encountered some technical difficulty here. I don't know if you noticed, but I want to wrap it up by giving you the opportunity, Juice, to offer any concluding remarks.
Well, no, first off, I would say again, thank you so much for the opportunity to have this conversation with you. I certainly am always enriched by it, and I look forward to the opportunity to get back up to Washington, D.C., where we can be even more interactive up there. Your colleagues typically ask very challenging questions, and I really do enjoy that. I guess the main message here is with regard to security cooperation. Listen, these efforts aren't perfect, but they're getting better. And they absolutely are, one of the key underpinnings to, our national defense strategy is to build that rigid constellation of allies and partners. What we're doing here is we're trying to, shape the preferences of others, right? So that, in this business of great power competition, so that, that we can continue global norms as we've enjoyed them, to date, which is, many of us, to include our partners, our competitors rather, have benefited from, which is the irony there. But ultimately, the strategy recognizes that the United States cannot be everywhere all the time, and we need to build reliability and stability within our partners, and that's what security cooperation endeavors to do. And I sure enjoy it.
Got it. Okay. Well, Duke, it's such a pleasure to host you, and obviously we look forward to having more conversations with you in the future. Stay safe. Do send my best to my buddy Phil Maxwell and your team.
I will.
And we'll stay in touch with you, and stay safe. Okay.
Thank you. Take care, my friend.
All right. Adios. Bye.